I can get a better job out of my professional gear in a helicopter, but of course there's a lot of things you can't do. Autonomy is the prime thing for me with drones. Because I've been taking photos for more than 30 years from the air, an aerial view isn't a novelty for me, but the autonomy is. And I absolutely love the freedom of being able to go out anywhere, anytime, getting a drone out and taking photos.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello everyone, this is Randy Goers and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 291. How does one create a successful long-term career in aerial photography? For that question, we head to Australia to speak with Fiona Lake, a professional photographer based in tropical North Queensland. Fiona has more than 30 years' experience in agricultural photography and has become Australia's most well-known outback photographer. She specializes in agriculture and the world's largest cattle stations, and has taken aerial photographs from helicopters since 1988. Her multifaceted business includes books, exhibitions, and farm tours, as well as commercial photography. Less than 2% of Australia's fully licensed drone pilots are women, and Fiona is one of them. She runs drone masterclasses across Australia and more recently in the United States. Her World Drone Academy covers everything a drone pilot needs to know to fly safely, legally, productively, and enjoyably. In 2018, Chicago-based Women in Drones named her as a woman to watch in UAS, along with 9 other women from 7 different countries. In 2020, she was the winner of the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists Photography Award. She has also been recognized by the Queensland government as a community digital champion and one of 100 faces of small businesses. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Fiona talks about helicopter and drone aerial photography, what to look for in a drone training program, and she offers insights into a variety of aerial photography questions. Most importantly, how can one develop a successful long-term career in photography? But before we hear from Fiona, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And by the way, if you have an idea for a great show and want to share your experience, please contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's learn how we can create a successful career as a drone photographer with Fiona Lake. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Fiona to introduce herself.
Yes, I'm Fiona Lake. I'm a professional photographer. I live in Northern Australia and I've been flying drones for a few years now.
When you say professional photographer, can you give us an idea of what that entails?
I have a bit of an odd business because, to give you a really quick summary, I started taking photos in the 1970s, started selling them in the early 80s, and then started taking aerial photos in the late 1980s in mustering helicopters on what are the largest cattle stations or ranches in the world. And then I bought a drone a few years ago when the Phantom 4 came out because it was the first off-the-shelf drone that was good enough for my kind of clients. But I also produce books, and now I also run workshops. I've taken farm tours overseas, amongst other things. I judge photography competitions and this, that and the other thing. So commercial photography is part of what I do. I also have exhibitions, and the last one I had actually was in the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC. So it suits me. I like variety. But in this day and age, it's smart for professional photographers to also have a few different avenues for income.
When you started your career, what type of images were you shooting?
I grew up on a farm, so I've always had an interest in practical photography. I've never been interested in just taking photos that are beautiful. I've always been interested in photojournalism, an image that tells a story, but there's a point to the story as well. So I first started taking photos where I grew up, and then when I went to work on one of these large cattle stations, that's when I started taking agricultural photographs from a commercial point of view. Really, taking photos of people at work is what most interests me, particularly if they're doing work that is overlooked or underestimated by others. And I travel to remote areas, so I go to places that often are a bit out of sight, out of mind.
Were you hired by the company to document their work or use it for promotion?
No, I did art all through school and wanted to study art when I left, but again, having a practical streak, having grown up on a farm, I thought I better get a proper job because I know there's no money really in the arts. So I went off to agricultural college and studied rural business administration, and that's how I got the job on this station. I was looking after the books and the store, because our stations are often, the bigger ones are a long way from the nearest town. They'll be 100 kilometres or more from the nearest town, and the nearest town only being tiny. So they can be like little communities in themselves. So I would take photos in my spare time, selling them. And I guess that is how a lot of photographers over the years have started, probably more than most professions. People start on the side and then they grow it gradually to the point where they can give up what is their proper job, in inverted commas.
How did you end up in helicopters?
Well, that took a bit of persuading, and they were probably sorry, because then I would nag people ever after that. And I felt very lucky because most people aren't permitted to go on helicopters. They're only small, and, the chopper pilots have to put you down on the ground when they have to do fancy flying. When they're chasing cattle or whatever, they don't have a passenger in there. But mainly the reason why I was allowed onto these properties that I was permitted to go to, and still am to this day, is because people could see what I set out to do. And then once I had a bit of a track record, I could point them to what I'd already done. I also taught myself how to write magazine stories. And so we have a national rural magazine here called Outback magazine, and I started producing stories for them in 1999. And so I sort of had the runs on the board. So I was always thinking, what is in it for these people to let me come onto their place? And that is something I sometimes see lacking. You've always got to think, what's in it for the other person? Why should they help you? Why should they have you visit their place? Why should they put up with my questions? Because I'm very curious. I'm always asking questions. And then slowly built a reputation that way. And I've been fortunate. I've been allowed on places that normally don't allow journalists or photographers on.
Was the Phantom 4 your first drone?
Yes, it was. And it was because someone I knew in the mining industry just showed me some footage, because I'd seen other stuff online and it was hideous. And I'm a perfectionist to a fault. It is a fault, because there's things I don't get done simply because they're not perfect. But I saw the footage and went, okay, right, I've got no excuse now. And so I went and bought one, and then I've kept upgrading. And I have a Mavic 2, which I know so many people prefer, but I only ever fly it. It's my backup drone when all the Phantom batteries are flat, because I still prefer the Phantom for a few reasons. I'm very impatient. I'm a very impatient person. I like to be able to get it out of the hard case and just off you go. There's no faffing around with weird gimbal covers and unfolding things and tricky stuff. And I catch land it, which keeps it out of the really fine dust, which is common in the areas I often fly in.
How did the imagery compare to the cameras you were taking on helicopters?
Well, because I'm not using, more expensive, fancier drones, it's not as good. I can get a better job out of my professional gear in a helicopter, but of course there's a lot of things you can't do. Autonomy is the prime thing for me with drones, because I've been taking photos for more than 30 years from the air. An aerial view isn't a novelty for me, but the autonomy is, and I absolutely love the freedom of being able to go out anywhere, anytime, getting a drone out and taking photos, which beforehand I had to wait for a pilot. And because they were working, doing their job, I could only get photos that fitted in with their job, because their work obviously was the priority. And because it was in remote areas, chartering choppers is never an economic prospect. You'd be looking at thousands of dollars, and mostly my work is freelance, so it's just not economic. So it's really made it feasible. And to my surprise, fewer people have taken up buying drones here and using them for professional photography in the industry that I'm in, which is agriculture. So I get invitations to go, long distances, as in more than 2,000 kilometres away. I will get invited, which of course is it's more than 1,000 miles anyway, 1,500 miles away, different states. I get invitations, and it's odd that there just isn't someone else.
Is there a quick way to describe your path through the industry?
Not really, because I've always looked for gaps in the market. When others come along and are doing a similar thing, then I move off to something else. And I actually thought there would be more people running workshops and more people doing the kind of professional photography work that I do. But in actual fact, I'm still the only one. And it's got to the point where I'm thinking this is crazy, and capacity building in regional areas is now something I've been working on for a couple of years, because I really want to teach other people how to do what I do, because I want to give opportunities to others, and I get far more offers than I can actually do. There's other things I want to do as well. I want to write books and a few other things that have been waiting in the wings. So I actually want to help others get into it.
Is that the objective behind the Rural Drone Academy?
Yes, it is. I'm passing on what I know, and what I really wish I could have just gone and spent a day doing the kind of workshop I'm running, because it's got a combination of things that you don't normally find, because there's educational institutions running training, and Australia's licensing is, I think, probably the most expensive in the world and not easy. We have to spend a week, we have to do a flight test. Then if you go the second step to get an operator's certificate, you've got to spend another $2,000 or so. So it's more than $4,000 all up is what it cost me, and it's quite high level. I mean, I can go and get permission to fly around Sydney Harbour if I want, and I've got no desire to do that kind of work, which leads me on to another point. In Australia and probably other countries, we really need a tiered licensing system. So we need something really basic, an online questionnaire and a drone registration, and then a mid-level, and then for people in regional areas who don't want to fly in populated areas or controlled airspace. And then we need the sophisticated level of training, which is what I undertook, but there's nothing in the middle. So I try to provide that, although there's no certificate in the end. I try to provide something practical, business-focused, how to avoid problems, how to solve problems, and realistic advice on the opportunities that are in the industry as distinct from the myths.
How many days does the course run?
Depends on the host, because I don't organise these. They're run by different government departments, agricultural organisations, sometimes arts bodies fund aerial photography workshops. But a one day is usually ideal for agricultural, even half day. Aerial photography, 1 day or 2 days. The longer you've got, the more information you go through, but it's also good because people get to test out some of it, and then if they have more issues, then they can come and ask questions, because as we all know, we can all head off to training, it's fantastic, and then you go home and something doesn't work. And particularly if you're in a remote area, and then it's really hard to get to second base when the information you got wasn't quite complete or isn't working for you.
What sort of topics do you cover?
Sometimes I run general workshops, so it's just for anybody who wants to fly a drone for any purpose. And then I've got 2 specialty topics which bolt onto that according to who is hosting it. So if it's an agricultural organisation, then I specialise in, I might be in a farming area or I might be in a livestock area. So, for example, I've got 2 workshops coming up in a livestock area, and I'll be talking about mustering using drones, what you can and what you can't do, what is feasible. And also I talk about other types of ag technology that do some jobs better than drones. Everyone wants to fly beyond line of sight, and in reality, water sensors are one of the things that they should be looking at instead. Cheaper, easier, safer, more reliable. And people are sometimes looking to use drones for things that they're really not ideally suited for.
Coming from rural Australia, where there may be only a handful of drone enthusiasts, what was it like for you to attend your first drone conference?
The first drone conference I went to on a large scale was Interdrone, and it was like landing in heaven because there were so many like-minded sort of personalities there, outward-looking, can-do kinds of people, entrepreneurial, so interested in meeting other people, interested in new ideas, interested in thinking about the potential, and with a good imagination, but also practical. That's sort of a revelation. And so I think it's been a magnet, the drone industry, for people who are like that. So when they get together, they tend to get along well.
So was I correct that there are not many drone pilots in your area of Queensland?
Well, there is a lot. There is a lot of drone pilots, and there are a lot of professional photographers, but I'm in a niche. I'm in a fairly defined niche market. And part of the reason why I keep getting the work is because I've got a reputation that I've built up over a long time because I've stuck with it. So it's not that we need more drone pilots, but it's professional standard. So there's a lot of people taking photos, but they're not operating as a professional. And there's a big difference, of course, between popping out and taking a great sunset or whatever else just happens to be in front of you and meeting a brief for a client who needs images for a particular purpose, you know, for particular marketing purpose. So, you know, filling a shot list and also asking them what their aims are with the images. So that's really what sorts out the sheep from the goats, just popping out and taking great photos, because there's a lot of people who are fantastic at that, but having to do a good job of things that you might not be interested in, or when the weather's bad, or when you're under time pressure, or you can only be there in the middle of the day, not early and late when the best light is, those extra level challenges is the difference.
What quality stands out in helping a person become a truly successful photographer?
To do a really good job, you've really got to be a thinker. You've got to think about the other person. You've got to think about the people seeing it. And I guess drone groups are probably a bit of an example. There's a lot of people posting images in there and in Instagram, you know. And the thing is, some have thousands of followers, but a lot of them will be other photographers. And photographers tend not to buy photographs. You know, the old joke of how many photographers does it take to change a light bulb? You know, it takes 49 to say they could do it better and one to actually do it. So I don't actually put a lot of my drone stuff online because there's no need, because clients come to me directly. They don't come by Instagram or other social media accounts. So, you know, there's a lot involved.
In terms of online resources, what do you enjoy most?
The Facebook groups, I've learned a huge amount, and partly because I run workshops, they've been incredibly useful because you see the misinformation that there is. You also see the common questions, the things that people want to know, things that can go wrong, what people need a hand with. But the fundamental thing is, of course, and this is where I guess plenty of people go wrong, but probably not people who listen to podcasts like this, because they're probably doing better research than just asking on Facebook. But everything should be verified, and ultimately everybody needs to go to the National Aviation Authority and get the information from the horse's mouth. And there's a lot of arguments on the nitty-gritty of laws when fundamentally what people should be thinking about is safety, because all the aviation bodies, what they care about is safety. So whether something illegal is or not is less important than whether it's actually safe or not. And that's something I do bang on about a bit in workshops. And I give examples of all the things that can go wrong. You know, losing connections, the app stops running, battery issues, yada, yada. I give lots of examples so that people understand that, you know, it can drop like a rock if you're really unlucky. And is it going to damage somebody or something if your drone falls out of the sky? And to keep that top of mind. So, yeah, groups useful, but steer clear of some is my advice, and only go to the well-moderated ones.
What social media platforms seem to work the best?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because there's probably not so many professionals on Facebook groups, and I'd say that about Instagram as well. And when I say professionals, I mean sort of long-term, you know, who've been around for a while and going to last, because Instagram can be pretty popular, but whether it actually makes many dollars for people, I'm pretty doubtful. LinkedIn's fantastic. Obviously, the professionalism on LinkedIn, anyone who's in business, really any kind of business, should be on LinkedIn and be discerning who you connect with, because there's a lot of people involved in regulation and that kind of thing, conference managers, organisers as well on LinkedIn. Twitter I love, but there's not so much in the drone industry on Twitter. And Facebook traditionally is parochial, but really the drone groups are useful, particularly for anyone travelling to another country, because you can quickly get pointed to a source of good information if you're travelling, when we're allowed to travel again, of course.
When you're doing your workshops, is there a difference between the type of questions that men and women ask?
Quite often I've been asked to run an agricultural drone workshop or more an introductory session in a multi-topic day. And typically after that, this is when I get these questions that are really, really highlighting the difference. And because I don't cover these things so much in the workshop, men so often will come up afterwards and they will ask, I mean, you could probably guess, because mostly when I ask people to guess, they can usually guess. So many men will ask, how high does it go, how fast does it go, and how far does it go? It's hilarious. And sometimes I'll just get one after the other come up to me after a session and ask the same thing. Whereas the women typically, I've rarely had a woman ask that anywhere. They typically go ask how much are they hard to use, and what are they useful for? You know, are they worth buying? Is this thing really going to make my life better? They don't view them as toys. It's like a tool, you know. So I'm quite fascinated with that difference. And I discovered that a few years ago, and it's carried on since then. And it's interesting when I run workshops too, because all the sessions I've gone to have been run by blokes, and usually there's only about 10% women, roughly, depending, a bit less, a bit more. When I run one, almost invariably, it'll be around 50-50. So I think that's very interesting in itself, that women are more inclined to come if it's a woman running, and they'll also ask more questions than they will when they're really outnumbered. So I really would like to see more diversity in the industry, and it's certainly not about women being better, because, I mean, look, if it was up to me, and originally I would have gone, that thing will never work, and drones never would have got invented. So, you know, we really need a combination of men and women in the industry, and typically drones are designed for men. The Phantom 4 battery, for example, sometimes I even find it quite hard to get that battery out, and I don't have weak hands, but like professional photography gear is also made for blokes' hands. It's bigger and heavier, and it's made for men to handle. So, and that's how you know from the outset it's been designed with a bloke in mind. And women can be so used to dealing with that, they don't even think about it. But I went to buy a Canon 1D a few years ago and picked it up, and I went, there's no way I'm buying one of these to carry around, you know, because on a busy day I'll be carrying it for 12 hours. And drones, I think, a little bit the same, and they're sold to men. And most of the I've been to many conferences where all the keynotes men, and the women, there might not even be many speakers who are women unless they're on a panel. And a lot of people wouldn't even notice or wouldn't even think it's a thing, but it makes women feel like they're sort of, you know, are we really welcome here? Do we belong here? And the events I've gone to where there's a more even mixture have been so much more. The conversations tend to be more complex because people will raise a wider variety of topics, and they'll have a wider variety of points of view, and they're just more interesting.
Do you think that might have something to do with the lower number of women in the drone industry overall? I mean, men seem to want to just jump right in, where women are more analytical and want to see the value proven to them first.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is why men are great. Like, I'm waiting for men to thoroughly test jetpacks before I go and buy one. You know, like there'd be no way most women would be going out and buying a jetpack. We're going to wait for all the men, you know, who don't even think about safety to go and test them out thoroughly. But, yeah, look, and there's the old argument, is it nature or nurture? You know, are women born being more cautious or not? Who knows? And that argument is, you know, as old as the hills. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because what we've ended up with is women mostly being a lot more cautious. And you know, it's why workplace health and safety on farms, for example, usually it's the women going, you really should have a helmet on, you really should have a guard on that grinder, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not to suggest that, I'm not saying all are like this and all are like that, but as a general rule of thumb, there's obviously tendencies.
Is it really possible for someone to make a full-time living from professional photography today?
It is pretty tough if that's all you're doing. Like wedding photographers probably still making a crust, but in terms of, like newspaper photographers professional newspaper photographers have just about become an extinct species. Now journalists tend to be handed an iPhone and told to just take a few snaps on the side. Even, we're talking national publications, even doing that, or you using viewer-submitted images which they weren't paid for and they were just taken on any old phone. So content is trumping technical quality, and that makes it really hard. So really, the way to make a living is to become a specialist. You find your niche, what you're interested in, where the gap in the market is, stick with it and become the best in that field or best in your area, because you can't beat local knowledge. You have the networks, the climate, the lay of the land. So becoming a local specialist is an alternative if there's not a particular industry that you want to focus on.
What would you most like to see change in the industry?
Well, I'd love the tiered licensing, as I saw, and no differentiation between recreational and commercial flying, because that is just ridiculous. I'm very jealous of the EU in the sense that they've seen the light, and a drone flight is a drone flight. Does it really matter whether someone is going to take a couple of photos they're going to sell or not? It absolutely doesn't. And it's a hangover of the manned aviation industry where a commercial pilot can carry paying passengers. So it's a completely different kettle of fish to a recreational pilot just getting in their little Cessna and going for a putt around the flat, in which case you do have to make the distinction. But in the drone industry, it's absolutely not relevant. What is relevant is whether the pilot is safe and whether they have any training. And at the moment, our system actively disincentivises training, because once you've got your licensee, then you've got a whole lot of admin. They're bringing in fees, and it means commercial pilots, fully licensed, will probably be paying a lot more money than someone who went and bought the same drone and hasn't registered it and hasn't licensed it, and they're taking photos with it and selling it to someone down the road anyway, on the quiet. So, and registration of drones at point of sale, I think, would be a good move. And just make it $10 a drone, make it really simple and easy. Just go online if you sell it or crash it, and notify, the aviation body that the drone no longer exists or you don't own it anymore. But I think we've really got an issue, and this would be global, with manned aviation bodies taking on drones because they're trying to make drones fit into what suits the manned aviation industry. And really, they should have sort of thrown it all out and started from the ground up.
What's the regulatory climate like in Australia?
Well, we're in the midst of getting more regulations introduced, which were put off, and we watched on in horror, actually, as the FAA, the issue of pilots having to be within mobile phone reception, having access, because geographically, most of Australia does not have mobile phone coverage. The most populated areas do, where most people do live, which is around particular coastal areas in southeastern Australia. But geographically, most of it doesn't. And most of the areas I fly in do not have any coverage at all. I've flown in places where I'm 200 kilometres or more from the nearest mobile phone tower, probably 300 kilometres actually, in some areas. So, hopefully we wouldn't get anything that silly being recommended for here, and it's probably a bad thing for any country, because most countries, I don't think, unless you're talking a tiny place like Singapore, has mobile phone coverage, over the whole country.
For those interested in training, what do you recommend that they look for in a workshop or a class?
Yeah, well, it really depends on what they want, and it's hard to know if you're just starting out and you don't have any knowledge. I think you're better off doing a good old poke around online to educate yourself a little bit first, because otherwise you're really not going to be able to tell whether you're going to get something that applies to you or not. And really it's whether the person running it is going to be able to relate to what you want to do with a drone, what you want to know. So I've had training, for example, I've gone to training sessions, and I'm being diplomatic sometimes, I'm not naming names or anything, but one training body, and the person running it had very little time spent flying a drone themselves. They'd never been in business. They didn't know anything about agriculture. They weren't a photographer. And I went along to that, and I To be honest, it was a 2-day thing and I learnt hardly anything and I was horrified. And really that particular experience was what motivated me. And I thought, well, I can't sit around criticising. I should put my money where my mouth is and try and do a better job. So it's looking at who's running it and drill down the nitty-gritty of what they're going to be talking about, what they're going to cover, and whether that is going to apply to you.
Of the drone images that you've taken, do you have a favourite?
It's a bit like choosing favourite children without the complaints. Probably one favourite was one that won an award earlier this year. It's an aerial photograph of a bullocky and his bullock team. And I really like it because it sort of symbolises the best of the old and the best of the new to me. And I took it with the drone, of course, which is probably the new aspect. And on the road you can see vehicle tracks as well, because really the world's population owes, how our cultures are today. We got here via the use of animals like bullocks and horses, and this is unfortunately, sadly, largely forgotten. So culture and history and all these sorts of things just meld into my interests. But the award it won was the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists Star Prize. So it's quite a nice prize to win because you have to win in the state and then you have to win in the country. And then the third panel who does the judging is an international panel. And it's a photojournalism award, so the image has to tell a story. It's not just about being a pretty picture. I must admit that is one of my favourites, yes.
Do you have a memorable drone story that you can share?
Oh, I've probably got heaps, but one time I remember, here's an example, I was flying out I was like 200 k's in either direction to the nearest town, and I just pulled up and flying the drone by the road as I did. And a road train driver went past, and our road trains here are quite long, like 51 metres, 150 feet, whatever it is. And this bloke, I just remember, he just absolutely did a double take because I'm out in the middle of nowhere sort of thing, flying a drone. And seeing women flying drones isn't all that common, and at the time drones weren't all that common, and I'm older, like I'm not 19, so I think he might have thought he might have to steady up on the beans or whatever was keeping him awake between towns, because to see the look on his face, it was like, what? Yeah, very funny. Look, I like surprising people. I like challenging stereotypes and encouraging other people, because really just mixing it up just makes the world a more interesting place.
After flying in helicopters for so many years, what was it like seeing the images from the drone for the first time?
I was spoilt because I'd been in helicopters. It was like, oh, this is pretty handy. And it's nice running workshops because you get to see how excited people are and how much fun they're having, and it sort of reminds me to be more appreciative. Here's a funny thing too. One of my sons is actually a commercial pilot. At the time he was doing pilot training, and I said to him, this is my upfront thing, I said, if I buy a drone, would you get it going for me? Oh, yeah, that'd be great. So this is typical. So I bought the drone, it arrives in the box. I write, here you go, you set it up. So he set it up, off we headed, or found somewhere out in the flat to fly it where we weren't going to be disturbed. And he flew it, and we did this a few times, and then basically I just elbowed him out of the way, and then I kept flying it after that. Well, he wasn't that interested. He's more interested in flying planes.
What's been the most frustrating part about your photography journey?
Well, aerial photography was originally being the wrong timing. I was often in helicopters somewhere where the light would have been great at about 6 or 7 in the morning, or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that wasn't where I could be. Whereas now, of course, with the drone, if I'm not there, it's my own fault because I didn't get up early enough. And that's one of the things with professional photographers. If you're a landscape outdoor photographer, if you don't like getting up early, it's just not going to work. But I have had instances. Look, I was up on Cape York, which is a really relatively remote part of Australia. One time it was a commercial job. I was taking photos on a station for a property agent and got the drone out all ready to fly it. And it was geofence. DJI's, it was when they just introduced their geofencing. And again, I was like more than 100 kilometres from the nearest mobile phone tower, no reception. There was no way of connecting to the internet or anything, or unlocking it. And there was an airstrip there because all these stations have their own airstrips. Mail planes and things fly in. And there was actually a mob of cows walking across the airstrip. So nobody could have landed there, but I couldn't fly my drone there. But, the frustrations of trying to overcome problems. But, of course, I try to remind myself it's really good brain exercise. And I started on computers when they were just black and white, and you turned it on and there was just a cursor and you had to know how to run the startup program. And I'm not into problem solving. I'm not into technology. So, and running workshops is quite good because I say that to people. I say, look, I don't love technology. To me, all these things are tools. And if I need it repaired, I send it to the repairman. I mean, I'd fly fairly carefully so that ideally I don't crash.
What message do you have for women?
Look, do the research and launch into it. You build confidence by doing it. Drones have taught me, perhaps more than anything, that the world is built on systems. And don't ask me why it took me this long to figure this out, but it's all about systems. And any career, that's what training is. I mean, maybe I would have become a pilot after I left school because I've always loved being airborne. If I had known that, I didn't have the confidence. It was some mysterious thing to have the confidence to fly a tin can around with people sitting in the back. I would have had a heart attack. But it's all about systems. And now there are drone groups too, specifically for women. They sprang up largely in response to some of the knuckle draggers that have inhabited some of the other open drone groups, most of whom I think silent now. It's improved a lot over the last few years. But yeah, just give it a crack because they might be surprised how much they enjoy it. And don't buy a drone for your son, buy one for your daughter. That's what I say to people.
Is there anything that we missed that we should talk about?
Yeah, nothing that I can think of other than I'm really looking forward to getting back to drone conferences in person because this online business is all very well, but, I've got to know. I love coming back to conferences and I've been lucky that I've been invited back to some of the same ones. And it's like coming back and seeing old friends again, and it's really a good battery recharge that I don't think should be underestimated because a lot of us, work on our own. We're self-employed, freelance, whatever. It's fantastic to get back as a group and meet others and catch up. So I'm really looking forward to that whenever it is. Online's great, but it doesn't cut it. People want to see people in person.
And for my final question, Fiona, what message would you like to leave regarding the drone industry?
Yeah, well, seize the opportunities because I still see opportunities that are unaddressed. I mean, in Australia, two that spring to mind, for example, spray drone businesses. There's only about, as far as I can tell, 8 to 10 full-time spray drone operators in Australia. There's a huge opportunity for people to get into it. It costs roughly probably a year's wage to buy the gear and set it all up. But again, you've got to know the industry, you've got to know agriculture, you've got to understand plant. You can't swan in and think it's going to work. You have to know the industry and be able to talk to farmers. There are opportunities like that around there that are still, and also repair businesses. There's great opportunities for regional drone repair businesses. And these opportunities just don't seem to be being taken up at the moment. You've got to take a risk and it can take a while to build a feasible business. But fortune favours the brave, as I say. It's the people who get in early and stick with it who get the gold in the long run.
That's it for episode 291 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Fiona Lake. I want to thank Fiona for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about Fiona, her workshops, or just want to connect, check out the webpage at fionalake.com.au. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Gores.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.